So, I'm sketching the Cleveland experiment. Where that experiment goes and how far it will go, that will be determined by people in Ohio and elsewhere. But the model is particularly interesting in another respect. Most people, I suspect, in this room, and others who may be involved, really begin with the assumption that, you know, there's so much power in this system that nothing really can be done. Maybe we can elect a liberal Democrat. Maybe we can tinker around in the healthcare system. Maybe we can adjust possibly the minimum wage. Maybe we'll get some control of some of the climate issues. Maybe on the edges. But I suspect, I'm talking to the person in your chair, most of us don't believe it. And that's why we don't act. If we did, we would be in very different kinds of motion. My suggestion to you is that if you begin thinking about what's going on now in this way, there may be interesting possibilities that have not been discussed. So let me shift gears. I want to give you a couple numbers. You've heard them all before, but as you probably are aware, the top 1% of Americans owns literally 50% of the investment capital of the United States. That's a medieval number. That's a number that is structured in the way that medieval society was organized. The top 5% owns 70% of investment capital. It is an extremely highly concentrated organization of capital. Now, that is a power system, as the last couple of speakers talked about. But I also note, and I think it is of terribly great importance, that during the financial crisis, large numbers of people were talking about down with Wall Street. This was a very interesting phenomenon. The only people who talked about Wall Street in that way were Marxist study groups 5 years ago. Ordinary people were saying down with Wall Street. And I would suggest to you that when the next financial crisis comes, and when we see the failure of the pseudo attempts to regulate that sector, down with Wall Street will come up again, people will feel the pain, and were we, quote, shovel ready, unquote, with a very sophisticated and serious programmatic plan, nationalizing some of these banks would have been right on the table. It is not impossible to understand the net nature of the anger that is building, which is currently being tapped by the right wing and pointed at government. It is also demonstrably, we just saw it in the last 3 years, easily diverted and potentially diverted at the large sectors that in fact are causing great pain. The reality is they are. So now I've shifted gears. What I was talking to you about was a positive reconstructive model beginning at the bottom and working up through construction. I've just said something about attack and mobilization through attack, something we don't like to think about. The problem in what I've just said, though, and here's what I want to press on you, because the last two speakers were talking about this, and the gentleman from Latin America, he was talking about what is happening in the left throughout most of Latin America, except for 2 countries, and the words are carefully chosen. He said, this is social democracy in action. Remember that? He did not say liberal capitalism, and he didn't say socialism. He said social democracy in action, and he was right. And why do I point that out? Because I think it's very important, I think, the distinction. Because social democracy, or what we call liberalism, the European term, begins with the assumption of large order capitalist corporations, and it assumes that you can in fact regulate and control them and sufficiently tax and sufficiently spend to achieve social programs, commonly known as the welfare state, and sufficient power to manage the system. That is social democracy. Classically, Sweden, Denmark, West Germany, then Germany, France to a certain degree. The European model. It is a capitalist corporate model with sufficient power to regulate that model. And what he was saying is that, in fact, what is beginning in Latin America, in his judgment, is a movement towards social democracy in action, the mobilization of people to do the same thing. Possibly, Michael explained this last night, with bits and pieces of socialism around the edges. Social Security, public utilities, etc., maybe the rail system. That's the model. What I think is important to think about, and I would suggest recognize, and then I would say deal with, is that what we're talking about in the United States may very well be a different model. One of the interesting things about this country, and it bears close examination, is unlike the European social welfare states, we never completed social democracy before we began to retreat. Now, I say that we could get into a very big academic discussion about it, but I want to make one or two points that are terribly important to understand. The American state, and Michael was talking about this last night, does not have the power to manage the system in the way the Swedish state does. It is too much controlled by corporate power and diverse corporate power fighting with each other. And also, the labor union side of the American mix is far, far, far weaker than you find throughout most of the continent. The labor unions peaked in the United States in the mid-1950s. They peaked at 35% of the labor force. Sweden is 85%. We are now, it is declining, they're all declining. We are now declining to just a little over 7% in the private sector. The basis of a social democratic movement and organization has always been, at the heart of it, organized labor. That model is not the American model. It may or may not be possible to organize an effective social democracy in European countries, some and all, make different mixes. But I'm suggesting to you that this country, for complex reasons, including the radical racial structure of the country compared with most European countries, a whole quadrant of the society was controlled for most of our history until the two-thirds point of the 20th century by terror and violence to destroy democracy by keeping blacks out of the picture. It's a very different model. Weak labor, radical racial divisions. It's a different country. Now, what I've just said is that American liberalism needs to be reassessed in terms of its capacity. I will take whatever we can get. I come out of liberalism. There are many, many people in great pain. I am not arguing against trying to do improvements in Social Security and health care and so forth, and environment. Whatever we can do on that front is important. I'm suggesting to you an analytic point which, if right and if grasped, suggests different consequences. And it is this. The possibility of achieving the goals that people care about in this country, people in this room I suspect, through that model are very, very low. We are not the European model. Now, some of you academically inclined will know I'm talking about a certain form of American exceptionalism. There are reasons why America is much different and weaker in its welfare state capacities. But now what have you got? You've got a system in great decay which doesn't collapse, but doesn't succeed. Doesn't collapse and doesn't succeed. Now, if that's true, and we could go into that at some length, if that's what we're looking at, if that's the model we're looking at, decay, economic chaos, but not the Great Depression, put it in a different way, not a classic Marxist collapse, and not a liberal, the pendulum will swing upbeat, but decay and stalemate with occasional reforms and occasional losses as the context we are entering. Think about that one. I'm talking about your lives. That may be the context we are entering. And if it is, I'll call it stalemate and decay and occasional minor crisis. By minor, I mean not collapse. That is the context in which people lose belief in what is going on and don't know what to do. Very few times in American history, or in anybody's history, do ideas change. The possibility of change begins when people begin to say something is really wrong here. Something doesn't make sense. By the way, this is the richest country in the history of the world. If you were to divide the economy up, every family four would have something of the order of $170,000. If technology goes forward at minimal rates compared with the 20th century,